Welcome to the video on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Chapter 8. This is part 2. Now, if you're one of my classes watching this, I would strongly advise you to have the question sheet out in front of you. Because the questions that I've put down work chronologically through the chapter. So as you'll kind of get to the bit that I'm talking about, you'll probably find the answer to the questions in there. That way you can pause the video and get your answers down on your big sheets as we're going through it. You also need a copy of the text in front of you. And again, you should have access either to the PDF or to the Word document of the full text in front of you. That way, follow it through, please, as I'm talking, as you would do normally in class. Okay. So just to remind you, this is Chapter 8, Part 2. Now, in Part 1, the first video, it looked at obviously the first part of the chapter because it's a very long chapter compared to a lot of the other ones that we've seen so far in Jekyll and Hyde. And just to give you a quick recap, the chapter begins with Utterson at home, all third person still, don't forget, but we're following Utterson's story primarily. So Utterson's at home and suddenly out of the blue one evening he has a call at the door and it's Paul, who is Dr. Jekyll's butler, so he's the chief man in Dr. Jekyll's household. He's very upset, he seems very distressed, and he asks for Utterson's help. And Utterson is a little bit reluctant at first because he doesn't want to get involved in something, because we've looked quite a lot at the importance of a gentleman's reputation in the Victorian era, and how if perhaps Utterson got involved in something with Jekyll that perhaps brought out some kind of scandal, it could destroy Dr. Jekyll's reputation. But when Paul's evident distress makes Utterson realise that there is something serious going on, Utterson has no hesitation actually going round to Dr. Jekyll's house. If you recall, the evening is quite dark and quite still, and there's an emptiness to the streets that unsettles Utterson. And then when they arrive at Dr. Jekyll's house, all of Dr. Jekyll's staff are standing in the hallway, which is lit by the blazing fire, with the fire signifying hope and warmth and togetherness. And the staff there are evidently very, very distressed by the changes that seem to have been going on in the household. As Paul talks to Utterson, tells him his fears, it becomes evident that there may be some kind of foul play that's taken place. And foul play in the Victorian era meant that there was perhaps a murder or some terrible crime that had taken place. Dr. Jekyll hasn't been seen around the house at all, but there is someone or something that's living in the cabinet at the bottom of Dr. Jekyll's garden. And Poole is absolutely convinced it's not Dr. Jekyll who is in the cabinet. He claims to have seen the person who is in the cabinet, and it talks about the fact that he refers to the fact that that this person in the cabinet is a lot shorter than Dr. Jekyll, as he tells Utterson that he's been butler at Dr. Jekyll's house for some 20 years. And as he says, do you not think that I know where Dr. Jekyll's head comes to in the door frame every morning? And that the person who has been living inside the cabinet or hiding in the cabinet is a lot shorter. There's a conversation that takes place between Utterson and Jekyll, and it's very clear that Utterson and Poole, and it's very clear that neither of them wants to admit that the person inside the cabinet is Hyde, but eventually Utterson has to ask the question, and Poole says that he believes very strongly that it is Mr. Hyde in there. The person in the cabinet, assuming it is Hyde, has been sent regularly for his staff to take out to various pharmacists or chemists, dispensing chemists around London, and he's desperately in need of a particular variety of a chemical. Now we find out later that the chemical that he originally had, that he used in his first round of transformations, had some kind of impurity in it. Now Dr. Jekyll wasn't aware of this at the time, so he doesn't know what it was. Whatever it was that was the impurity in this one particular chemical was causing the chemical changes to take place that allowed him to turn into Hyde. Now we find out later in the book, in the last chapter, that he has become Hyde so often that now there's an imbalance in his brain, and he's perhaps more Hyde than he was Jekyll, which means that he's automatically turning into Hyde without having to take the potion, and he's having to take the potion to turn back into Jekyll. Now, if you recall, in Chapter 4, when Mr. Hyde perform the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, he knew that at that point, back in the narrative, that he had to remain as Dr. Jekyll, because if he's found again as Mr. Hyde, he will be executed for the crime. Now, the fact that he's now automatically turning into Hyde involuntarily, so he can't stop it, means that he's in fear of his life. And whatever or whoever it is that's inside the cabinet, who we know to be definitely be Mr. Hyde later on, is very desperate for this chemical. And his attitude towards his staff is getting more desperate because he needs this one variety, this one batch of the drug that it was that he first took, in order for him to go back into the character of Dr. Jekyll. Okay, and we left it just where Poole and Utterson are at the front part door to the cabinet. They've sent round two other members of Dr. Jekyll's household staff round to the back door, which, if you remember, is the door that goes onto the by street that Enfield and Utterson talked about in the very first chapter. And they're getting them at the station at the back in case whoever it is tries to exit through the back door, as they know that Utterson and Poole are coming in through the front door. Okay, so that's just where we've left. So the paragraph begins with Poole swung the axe over his shoulder. So if you get that in front of you now, okay, with the questions. Poole swung the axe over his shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leaped against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship. And it was not until the 5th that the lock burst in sunder, and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. Now, the main thing to take from that paragraph there, the short paragraph there, is where it talks about the screech that's heard from inside the cabinet, and it refers to it as of mere animal terror. We've got the reference again to Hyde being like an animal, and the fact that we've got this word terror, this suggests that the confrontation from Utterson and Poole is not something that Hyde wants. He's terrified. He's like a frightened animal. So perhaps Stevenson, at this point, the author, is trying to maybe bring some sympathy, perhaps towards the person inside the cabinet, which is unusual because we've not really had any sympathy that has been evoked from Hyde up until now. The besiegers, that means the people that are entering the room, the besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth, the kettle singing its thin strain, a drawer or two open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and nearer the fire the things laid out for tea. The quietest room, you would have said, and but for the glazed presses full of chemicals, the most commonplace that night in London. Now, it's interesting to note here the way that the mood suddenly changes, because the room that they go into isn't a place of terror and fear. It's described in a very positive way. If you think, we've got the fire that's glowing, and as we know, the fire in Victorian literature is a symbol of hope and warmth and light. And here, the fact that the fire is glowing, it talks about the quiet lamplight. It talks about the stillness. It talks about things laid out for tea. So afternoon tea has been set out. So it's a very unusual atmosphere, because it's not exactly what they were expecting, and it's not what we, the reader, were expecting either. So there's this strange juxtaposition between the violence with which they enter the room and then the calmness and the stillness that they find when they get in there, which is really quite unnerving. Right in the midst there lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. Now, the word contorted means kind of like twisted up and really quite unusual in its positioning. They drew near on tiptoe, turned it on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. The cords of his face still moved with a semblance of life, but life was quite gone, and by the crushed phial in his hand and the strong smell of kernels that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer. Now, from that paragraph there and that term, the body of a self-destroyer, this implies to us very strongly that Dr. Jekyll has committed suicide. It talks about the fact that there is no semblance of life. It talks about the smell of kernels. Now, the smell of kernels will be the smell of whatever it is that's inside the phial or the test tube that he's holding, and it will be some kind of poison that he's used to commit suicide. Now, this is very, very important to note, because the body that they turn over has the face of Edward Hyde, but he's dressed in clothes that are far too big, clothes of the doctor's bigness. Now, this implies that when he took the potion to commit suicide, he was actually in the body and mind of Dr. Jekyll, not Mr. Hyde. And yet, as he's then, as the poison takes hold, his body's transforming into into Mr. Hyde. Now, that is very, very important to notice because we know that Mr. Hyde is a very, very selfish man, and although he wouldn't want to be caught as Mr. Hyde, because of course we know that he'd be executed for the death of Danvers Carew, we also know that perhaps he's too selfish a man to commit suicide. So that implies to us that in one of the brief moments when he was Dr. Jekyll, he had to commit suicide then, because it's only Dr. Jekyll's mind and the very positive attitude, I suppose, and the goodness that we still hang on to, that little bit of goodness that's within Dr. Jekyll. It's only then that he would commit suicide. So he commits suicide as Dr. Jekyll, but then as he's the poison is taking hold, that's when he turns into Mr. Hyde. So the dead body is actually that of Mr. Hyde. "We have come too late," he said sternly, "whether to save or punish. Hyde is gone to his account, and it only remains for us to find the body of your master." Now, don't forget, at this point, they have no clue whatsoever about the transformation that Dr. Jekyll has been making into Mr. Hyde. So all that they find here is the body of Edward Hyde in Dr. Jekyll's clothes, and they believe that they're looking now for the dead body of Dr. Jekyll, not realising that it's one and the same person. The far greater proportion of the building was occupied by the theatre, which filled almost the whole ground story, and was lighted from above and by the cabinet, which formed an upper story at one end and looked upon the street. The theatre here that they talk about, don't forget, is the old dissecting theatre, so it's a medical theatre rather than a performing theatre. A corridor joined the theatre to the door on the by-street, and with this the cabinet communicated separately by a second flight of stairs. There were besides a few dark closets and spacious cellars. All these they now thoroughly examined. Each closet needed but a glance, for all were empty, and all, by the dust that fell from their doors, had stood long unopened. So Utterson and Poole now and the other men are searching all the little sort of the cabinets and the little hideaways at the back of Dr. Jekyll's house and round by the cabinet and the theatre, believe that they're looking for the dead body of Dr. Jekyll. The cellar, indeed, was filled with crazy lumber, mostly dating from the times of the surgeon who was Jekyll's predecessor. But even as they opened the door, they were advertised of the uselessness of further search by the fall of a perfect mat of cobweb, which had for years sealed up the entrance. So they realised that these places haven't been entered for quite a long time because of the dust and the cobwebs that are covering the doors. So it seems that the body of Dr. Jekyll is nowhere to be found. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole stamped on the flags of the corridor. "He must be buried here," he said, hearkening to the sound. The flags being flagstones, which are big stones, I suppose like patio slabs that we see today. "Or he may have fled," said Utterson, and he turned to examine the door in the by-street. It was locked, and lying nearby on the flags, they found the key, already stained with rust. Now, this is important because if you remember, the last time that Dr. Jekyll turned into Mr. Hyde, he snapped the key in half so that he couldn't go out by the back door. Okay, and this is important because it means that there is that the fact that it says that the key broken in half was already stained with rust. If it's stained with rust, it's been there for quite some time, which means that there is no way that Dr. Jekyll could have exited through the very back door onto the by-street. So we've got this whole mystery for Utterson and Poole and the other people of the house as to where Dr. Jekyll is, whether he's alive or dead, because he's not to be found anywhere in the house, and there is no way that he could have exited out the back door. Now, don't forget, as readers of the time, they have no clue about this transformation of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. We only know it as modern readers because it's such a classic story, and we've heard the story many, many times. But this would be a real part of the mystery because don't forget, not only is the book a gothic story, but it's also a mystery, kind of like a detective story. And for the reader and for Utterson too and Poole, the mystery as to what's happened to Dr. Jekyll is considerable at this point in the book. "This does not look like use," observed the lawyer. "Use?" echoed Poole. "Do you not see, sir, it's broken, much as if a man has stamped on it." Ah, continued Utterson, and the fractures too are rusty. The two men looked at each other with a scare. This is beyond me, Paul, said the lawyer. Let us go back to the cabinet. Now, this idea about the key being snapped in half, we don't actually find this out until the last chapter, when we see in chapter 10, where we hear Dr. Jekyll's full account that he wrote that would be read by Utterson on the event of his death. So we, as the reader, don't know what's happened to this key yet, but we find out later on in chapter 10. They mounted the stairs in silence, and still with an occasional awestruck glance at the dead body, proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid on glass saucers, as though for an experiment in which the unhappy man had been prevented. That is the same drug that I was always bringing him, said Poole. And even as he spoke, the kettle, with a startling noise, boiled over. Now, the fact that when he committed suicide as Jekyll, he was in the middle of some kind of experimentation that using the same chemicals that Poole kept having to bring him, suggests that Dr. Jekyll was frantically trying to get hold of the same potion that he used for him to take as Hyde, so that it could remain as Jekyll. So we can see just how desperate he was, and the fact that he committed suicide in the midst of all this. So his suicide was something that was quite unplanned. This brought them to the fireside, where the easy chair was drawn cosily up, and the tea things stood ready to the sitter's elbow, the very sugar in the cup. There were several books on the shelf. One lay beside the tea things open, and Utterson was amazed to find it a copy of a pious work for which Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem, annotated in his own hand with startling blasphemies. Now, the book that he talks about that's open at the fireside next to the tea things, it talks about it being a copy of a pious work. Now, if something is pious, it means godly and religious. And the fact that this is a book that Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem. If something's held in esteem, it means it's held highly. In other words, the book that they find open next to the tea things is one of Jekyll's favourite works on religion, a very godly work. And the fact that it was annotated in his own handwriting with startling blasphemies. Blasphemies is anything that goes against religion. So it suggests that the book is open. It's one of Utterson knows it to be one of Jekyll's favourite works, religious works, and yet it's scribbled all over with lots of blasphemies and lots of anti-God comments and statements and perhaps swear words. And if you note, it says in his own hand. Now, as we know, the one thing that's common between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is their handwriting. But when he's consciously trying to show that it's different, he just slopes it the opposite direction. But of course, all the notes here that have been made on this book were never intended to be seen by anybody else. So it adds to the mystery here for Utterson, the fact that we have this book. It's one of Jekyll's favourite books on God and religion, and yet there are awful things that are scribbled all over it in Dr. Jekyll's own handwriting. Next, in the course of their review of the chamber, the searchers came to the cheval glass, into whose depth they looked with an involuntary horror. Now, the cheval glass, if you remember, is one of those large mirrors. So one of the big ones that you can kind of change the direction of, so you can the tall people can see into it, and then you kind of move it so it points downwards so that shorter people can look into it again. And as if you remember, we looked at this in one of the previous chapters, and it's an unusual thing for a Victorian gentleman to have had in his workroom, but we of course know it's because he was able to look at himself both as Jekyll and as Hyde, and so they're looking into this cheval mirror here and wondering what this mirror has seen. But it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof, the fire sparkling in 100 repetitions along the glazed front of the presses, and their own pale and fearful countenances stooping to look in. We talked about their countenances. Countenance is another word for their faces, and the fact that they're having to stoop to see their own faces in the mirror, it's another hint that whoever it was that's been looking in the mirror is somebody who's considerably shorter than themselves, and that we know to be Hyde. So it seems that Stevenson now is starting to kind of give us a few more little hints, if we're playing detective here, as to what might have gone on. This glass has seen some strange things, sir, whispered Poole. And surely none stranger than itself, echoed the lawyer in the same tone. For what did Jekyll— he caught himself up at the word with a start, and then conquering the weakness. What could Jekyll want with it? He said. You may say that, said Poole. Next they turned to the business table. On the desk, among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and several enclosures fell to the floor. Now, these enclosures or these envelopes are several letters that take up chapters 9 and 10, and it completely reveals to the reader and to Utterson and to everybody else what has actually gone on. And this is important because we've seen that Utterson has been in possession of several envelopes like this, either from Lanyon or from Dr. Jekyll himself, that he's been asked not to open until the death of either Lanyon or Jekyll himself. And the fact that Utterson has remained true to his word and has kept them in his safe and hasn't opened them reminds us of just what a trustworthy and very honest man he is. The first envelope was a will, drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one which he had returned 6 months before, to serve as a testament in case of death and as a deed of gift in case of disappearance. Now, the will that he talks about originally, if you remember, had stated that on the death or disappearance of Dr. Jekyll, everything should go to Mr. Hyde. And this was what really confused and quite upset Mr. Utterson for quite some time. But if you notice here, in this new will, there is a change here. In the place of the name of Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with indescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. So he himself now has become the sole benefactor of Dr. Jekyll's in Dr. Jekyll's will. He looked at Poole and then back at the papers, and last of all at the dead malefactor stretched upon the carpet. Now, the dead malefactor is referring to Mr. Hyde on the carpet. And if somebody's malefactor, any word that has mal at the start of it means badness or illness. So this is a reference to this wicked man that's lying dead on the carpet in front of them. My head goes round, Utterson said. He has been all these days in possession. He had no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced, and yet he has not destroyed this document. So Utterson at this point is really quite confused because he believes that Jekyll has been killed. He believes that the man that killed him is Mr. Hyde, and he is, as he says here, he's been in this room for several days with the will that states that Hyde is no longer the sole benefactor of all of Dr. Jekyll's possessions, and that in place it's Mr. Utterson, and yet the will hasn't been destroyed. Now, we know it's because Dr. Jekyll has been partly himself in the cabinet, partly Mr. Hyde. And so he's rewritten the will himself because he knows that the net is kind of closing on him. I think he probably knew in his last few days in the cabinet there that it would come to this, that it would come to him having to commit suicide. Utterson caught the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's handwriting and dated at the top. Oh, Poole, the lawyer cried. He was alive and here this very day. He cannot have been disposed of in so short a space. He must be still alive. He must have fled. And then why fled and how? And in that case, can we venture to declare this suicide? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe. So the second note that's inside the envelope, as well as the will, is a letter in Dr. Jekyll's own handwriting, and it's dated that very same day. So Utterson comes to the conclusion that Jekyll has not been killed, but he's been alive even that very day. And strangely, he wonders whether or not it's suicide in the case of Mr. Hyde. And actually, there's a hint there that perhaps Jekyll may have killed Hyde rather than vice versa. And as he worries there, he says, I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe. In other words, they're worried that all this coming out now might actually completely destroy Dr. Jekyll's reputation. Because, again, at this point, they do not realise that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person. So when Hyde is dead, so too is Jekyll. But they don't know that at this point in time. Why don't you read it, sir? Asked Poole. Because I fear, replied the lawyer solemnly. God grant I have no cause for it. And with that, he brought the paper to his eye and read as follows. My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared, under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee. But my instincts and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then, and first read the narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands. And if you care to hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll. So that little paragraph there was actually a note that Henry Jekyll leaves, and he's basically saying that when Utterson reads this note, something will have happened to Utterson. Something will have happened to Jekyll himself, and it implies that the end is sure. In other words, he's suggesting that when you read this, I'm probably going to be dead. And as he says here, he says, first of all, go and read the narrative, go and read the letter which Lanyon warned Dr. Jekyll he was going to write. And then, if he wants to know more, he needs to actually read the second enclosure, which is Henry Jekyll's full confession. Now, the letter that Lanyon wrote, and then the narrative or the confession that Jekyll writes, make up chapters 9 and 10. Okay, which is where everything, all the little gaps in the story, the things that we're not sure about, the things that the reader doesn't understand, actually are made very clear in those final 2 chapters that we'll come on to next week and the week after. "There was a third enclosure?" asked Utterson. "Here, sir," said Poole, and gave into his hands a considerable packet sealed in several places. The lawyer put it in his pocket. "I would say nothing of this paper. If your master has fled or he's dead, we may at least save his credit. It is now 10 o'clock. I must go home and read these documents in quiet, but I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police." Now, the fact that Utterson says here not to say anything, he warns Poole not to say anything. Of course, Poole and Utterson are very trustworthy men. If Poole were to go and say things to the other members of the household, who perhaps weren't as creditable, the story of what's gone on here might get out into the public. So Utterson is keeping his word to Jekyll. He is trying to save the doctor's reputation as best as he can. But it's interesting to note that at the end of that last paragraph there, he says, I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police. So Utterson is about to go home. He's going to read the contents of the envelope. He'll be back within the next 2 hours. And the fact that he wants the police to be called shows that he's not prepared to just push the whole thing up, despite Jekyll's reputation. So he's not only a man of his word, he's also a man of honour, integrity and the law. They went out, locking the door of the theatre behind them, and Utterson, once more leaving the servants gathered about the fire in the hall, trudged back to his office to read the 2 narratives in which this mystery was now to be explained. Now, we are at the end of chapter 8 out of 10 chapters. However, the narrative story, which starts with the Enfield and Utterson and the story of the door, and ends with the suicide of Mr. Hyde, the whole story is now over. The last 2 chapters that we go on to read, chapters 9 and 10, as I said earlier, are Lanyon's narrative, which Mr. Utterson goes home to read, and then Henry Jekyll's full confession, which is the second enclosure, that the envelope inside the package that Utterson will also go and read. So all of the little bits that come up in the next 2 chapters have already happened. Okay, but we as the reader don't know about these events. Okay, but the actual narrative, the actual events of the story have now come to a close. Okay, so go back over your big sheets now, fill in the questions, and make sure, please, that you do a chapter summary so that you have finished off your chapter summary for chapter 8. Okay, I'll see you next week for chapter 9 and 10. Bye.